Okay, it's making the link now.
Okay. Yeah, it says on my screen live on YouTube. Webinar is now streaming. I didn't know they had a YouTube live. We'll have to look into that.
Yes, and we're looking into it right now. We are live. It's the 11th house. This is Robert Phoenix. Let me turn my all-important volume down. Live. Yeah. So we're live. We're happening. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, all species who are attending our show today. This is the 11th house, Friday FARcast. In particular, I'm Robert Phoenix. And today I am joined by Zeus Yiamouyiannis. Right, I'm sorry.
Yiamouyiannis.
I butchered it again. We talked about this. So we just call you Zeus.
That's right.
For sure.
Or Dr. Zeus. If you want to be a little bit funny about it, Dr. Zeus. Sometimes.
Some people call you Dr. Zeus.
Yeah.
That's true, because you had a whole thing started that's online with Dr. Zeus. So welcome to the show, Zeus.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. I appreciate you being here. Yeah,
it's been a while, and the book has been out probably about a little less than a year now. Is that right?
Yeah, it's been out since basically late June. So about a half a year, a little bit more,
Right. So being the astrologer that I am, I wanted to get you on when Chiron went into Aries.
Okay.
Because Chiron in Aries is in my estimation, the wounded male.
Okay.
And there's a whole lot of backstory with Chiron in Aries. It's interesting. The last time Chiron was in Aries was when feminism really began to sprout in this country and globally, right? So that was really kind of the major kind of birth time of feminism with Chiron and Aries. We're talking 1968, 69, 70s. Well, here we are. Chiron's coming around again. It's the Chiron return of that time. And we've seemed to have reached this concrescence with this feminine identity related to identity politics. Mm-hmm. What's happening with men? And does Chiron and Aries portend a new turn or new evolution in this relationship with Chiron, masculinity and power, and how it relates to us guys? And by the way, you are an Aries, correct?
I am an Aries. In fact, my birthday is coming up in about a week, March 28th. So
but sort of planned this way, Zeus.
Yeah, I was going to say, not only am I Aries, I have a lot of signs, fire signs, and a lot of Aries influences in other houses and so forth. So I'm Aries plus Aries.
So I'm trying to get the most astrological bang for the buck.
You got it.
With you and this topic. So this is great timing. Yeah. So this book, The Spiritually Confident Man, Pioneering a New Frontier of Co-Creative Masculinity, is actually really good. Really, really good. And we're going to dive into it. We're going to get into what the spiritually confident man represents, the definition of it, examples of it, why it's different than older patriarchal or sort of toxic examples, and why it also diverges from the kind of the new normie of the not so toxic male. We're going to try to differentiate and distinguish between the two. So we're going to get into it, but before we do that, we want to find out about you and sort of how you got here today. Let's talk a little bit about your background. Obviously, you're a PhD. You've done a lot of consulting work. Let's go from there.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting when you talked about the other Chiron was in the late 60s. I was born in 1965. So my male development came right of age, right during this sort of feminist revolution. And I grew up on a farm in Ohio, in central Ohio, and where we had a very kind of, I wouldn't say androgynous in its modern sense, but androgynous in a sort of traditional sense. The girls and the boys on our farm didn't have these role separations, we all milked the cows, we all baled the hay, put the hays in the hay mow, we all were extremely athletic, and we were, we're all top athletes in our school, and we're smart as well. So it wasn't as if there was intellectual favor given the boys in our family or physical, demand given the boys. It was very, very broadly shared, and there weren't a lot of distinctions between our roles. So I always had a notion of masculinity and femininity that was not confined to roles.
Can I stop you there really quick? Because I think you're bringing up something really interesting. I watched this show. It's called Homestead Rescue.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about this family. They live in Alaska, and they're homesteaders, and they go into these failed homesteads,
Mm-hmm.
and they help these people kind of get back on their feet. So there's a son, there's a daughter, and then there's the patriarch. And there's this one episode where they go into a homestead in Pennsylvania, and the woman says, "Well, I do a lot of the women's work around here. I clean, and the gal who's helping her out, helping her build a hothouse, she says, look, on a homestead, there is no real separation of the masculine. Women do men's work and vice versa.
Right.
And I think this really has a connection to do with the natural world, mm-hmm. and sort of the roles that are defined by our interactivity with the natural world. And we, in many instances, are very far removed from that reality or that environment. And we've been really urbanized. And yes. I'm wondering if you have insights into that as it relates to this male-female dynamic.
I do. There is a polarity, and I talk about this in the book, between the feminine energy and principle and the masculine energy and principle. And what I say in this is that instead of trying to water it down, we should, in some sense, accentuate and honor it. But at the same time, we should not simply separate it and then make it an adversarial relationship between the two. So in some sense, I'm basically gearing toward the best of both worlds. Just like with the homestead, just like me growing up on the farm, there should not be rigidly defined roles which keep women out of vital work, engaging the land, engaging the farm, engaging physically, vigorous practices. And it should not keep men out of nurturing either, raising children, becoming intimate. And in fact, a good father serves as a good role model by being vulnerable and intimate with his sons and daughters both, but at the same time providing this very honorable and very straightforward and dependable, sort of responsible, strong figure. That's an androgyny that I'm talking about, not this notion of just sort of mixing sexes and trying to get rid of all kinds of distinction. Quite the opposite. I think this distinction should be accentuated and shared in a much more energetic way. And this is, we're going through a kind of stage right now where, especially with the Me Too movement and other things, people are trying to just throw off these rather oppressive, imposed roles. But actually, one of the ways back to a healthy relationship is to go back to the natural roles that you saw with homesteading, that you saw where men and women are sharing the work. It's not, there isn't this rigid definition. Now, in more, religiously oriented, say, intentional communities, they went back to the Bible, and already they were beginning to distort that a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a problem if women choose to do what's considered to be women's work. And I do have a big problem when people are sort of demanding women are not liberated unless they're getting out in the world, struggling in the profession. I think that's, and where we live right out here in the Sierra foothills, there's a lot of traditional stay-at-home moms and so forth, and I honor that as well. But the idea is to be able to develop natural affinities, natural talents, natural desires to share work, and certainly as children to be exposed broadly to those roles, male and female. Well, like I was, it's been a real benefit to me. Like I said, it helped my sister become top athletes in the school. It helped me become a top athlete, but it also helped me. I can tell a story where I was taking care of a lamb, because lambs sometimes are rejected by their mothers on the farm. And I don't think I've ever had such a pure, caring experience as when I was sticking my little finger in this tiny little lamb with this sort of Brillo pad wool on it in his mouth and curling up with him next to the old refrigerators where the heat's coming out the bottom, and just falling asleep with that curled up around that lamb just relying upon me and my presence to feel calm and safe and secure. And then both of us just sort of falling asleep. I mean, it was such a beautiful experience. I can't imagine my manhood or my boyhood or my ability to care for my own son now without that kind of experience. And unfortunately, men are oftentimes kept with that, especially with virtual reality, especially with violent video games and so forth. So to me, it's not like going back to traditional manhood. It's more allowing the masculine and feminine principles to accentuate and come forward. And when I say co-creative masculinity, to exchange those in a very powerful ways. So it's kind of, like I said, the best of both worlds. instead of the worst of both worlds. It's kind of what we have now, which we have a patriarchal overlay, a contention, and now this kind of mushy middle where we're trying to get rid of any kind of distinction at all. That to me is the worst of both worlds. We don't have any identity, and we have old stereotypes that don't work anymore. It's like, I'd just as soon sweep all of those to the side, allow all of us to advance in what I call our own divine genius. Let our gender be a beautiful part, a beautiful spice of expressing that into the world, and to discover and to create and to improvise and to be curious about who we are, rather than to simply just assert a package of characteristics or politically correct whatever it happens to be.
Right.
We don't need that.
That sounds very balanced coming from an Aries.
I try to be an evolved Aries.
Very Libra-like. You did a good job.
Yeah, the route there, especially with an Aries, is very headstrong, very stubborn.
Right.
Can be an interesting route. Let's just put it that way.
So I just want to get back to this story and the environment that you grew up with. That's a beautiful story about the land. Mm-hmm. You don't get to experience that in the city. You just don't.
You don't.
And to a large degree, urbanization mm-hmm. has led to sort of highly, I don't want to say evolved, but kind of highly developed models of specialization.
Right.
And when we get into those areas of specialization, we don't have the opportunity to experience this broad spectrum of influences in our lives. So when you're out on the land and you're growing up on a farm, it's not just you and your sisters and your identity. It's all these other species. It's the elements. Mm-hmm. It's everything that's involved. It's a broad spectrum of influences that are helping to create beings.
Exactly. And this is the problem. And I just talked about it on Regina's show. She just interviewed me on Gaia TV for her show, Open Minds. We talked about how the Industrial Revolution was the second Dark Ages. Because what did happen with the Industrial Revolution? It created this segmentation, this urbanization, which split your natural ties with the land, with other species, with the environment, even between the sexes. Everything became specialized, segmented and isolated and put in its proper place, quote unquote, proper place.
Right.
According to what? Some kind of engineering, objectified engineering mentality that was very, very unnatural.
Right.
It did not respect the way in which masculine and feminine energy flow. It attempted to bottle everything up and put it, and I think it was based in a fundamental suspicion and fear of the wisdom and the power of the natural world. Right. And in fact, the natural world became consigned to the feminine. Nature was feminine and culture was masculine. And then culture had to be the superiority of the masculine engineered over nature and against nature. Right. And that became then put into kind of a battle of the sexes, where nature is representing the feminine and culture, that's so-called superior masculine. That's the patriarchal mentality.
Yeah.
No healthy man that I know is healthy without a really solid, respectful, honoring relationship with nature and with connection. And it's that connection and the vibrancy of this distinct human being, what I call this divine genius each one of us has, which is absolutely distinct and is magnified through our masculinity or femininity and our races and sexes and sexual orientations and so forth, rather than diminished by it, that allows us to really be who we are. We step forward into that. We don't need politically correct labels. We don't need to be living in fear and simply trying to protect those, though I do believe in justice. I think it's more about a confident assertion of those things. And this is where my Aries does come in. I'm Mr. Assertion. And the sharing and exchange and curiosity of those that creates health and vitality. And going back to nature, I once did this essay in which I said there are three really important things if you observe nature. And it gets to what you're saying, Robert. One is distinctness. If you don't understand that you have a distinct divine genius, and you feel unable to accentuate that and offer that, there's going to be a spiritual disease from the start. So distinctness, and you see with a lot on both the patriarchal aspects on so-called right and the politically correct aspects on the so-called left, both are in animosity to that notion of distinctness. One wants to overwhelm it and the other one wants to water it down. Right. And I'm saying, no, bring that distinctness forward. That's what you have to offer in the world. The second element is diversity. So those people that are trying to become, sort of pure race, whatever it happens, obviously that happened in Nazi Germany and so forth, those go against the vibrancy of for instance, the rainforest. The rainforest is so powerful because it is so diverse that any insult to one aspect of that environment is easily buffered by this massive diversity that can go ahead and absorb that and make adjustments. So diversity is really helpful. And the final thing is exchange. If you and I, or men and women, cannot exchange that distinctness, and the different ethnic groups and the different ideas, right and left, can't have a respectful conversation, then that creates a sclerosis. There's a staticness.
Right.
And life is all about dynamism and exchange through semi-permeable membranes from one species to another. And if we cannot do that, then we're on the road to death. And that's why I talk about co-creative masculinity. That really has to do with that exchange orientation. But it means all three of them. Distinctness, I have to accentuate who I am, not water it down, or try to get it overwhelmed by somebody else. Diversity means I open myself up to new points of view. I open myself up to women, to children, to other nations, other ideas. And then finally exchange, this vibrant, honoring, curious, adventurous exchange of these ideas and energies. That's what's going to create an ecosystem in which culture can be reconciled with nature, rather than simply urbanization, segmenting it off and putting us on the road to ruin.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about that, and I agree with you. I think the diversity thing is a really interesting topic, because if you use the Amazon, for example, as an example, right, what you'll find is an incredibly diverse ecosystem that has had a long time to develop. Okay, so the relationships and the interconnected relationships between species or plant life, flora, fauna, these are evolutionary relationships that have developed over a long period of time. And you also have within that diversity groups that are to some degree still group oriented, even though they're living in a much broader ecosystem. What I mean by that is you won't find panthers living with a bird species like a hawk or something like that, right? I mean, they both have their relationships in their groups, but their groups are interconnected. And I think one of the things that gets lost on this idea around diversity, at least as we're being fed diversity, is that number one, we have to accept a model that's being presented to us. That's number one. And then number two, the models are often kludged together so that people cannot have their traditional kinds of bonds or relationships. Like, for instance, I had E. Michael Jones on a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about how New York had very specific neighborhoods, that there were Polish neighborhoods, there were Irish neighborhoods, and that's diversity.
It is.
And what happened is that they all got blown out with urban renewal.
Exactly.
And then they had to go move into the suburbs. And that rich kind of diversity, which I think is what you're getting at, was lost. And it was completely whitewashed under this umbrella of some new kind of organizing principle, right?
You can see the conceit, whether it's a liberal conceit or a conservative conceit. The conservative conceit usually takes more the patriarchal notion of just forcing or causing people to assimilate, all right? And the liberal conceit is a little more passive, but kind of backdoorish, but it still has the same kind of arrogance associated with it, which is saying, this is the way you should be. The other one's saying the same thing. It's just a little bit more overt about it. I don't know of too many mentalities which say, I really like the fact that there's a Polish neighborhood. I'm not trying to change that. I'd like to enter into that culture. I'd like to go ahead and invite that culture into mine. And for us to have that sense of hospitality and magnanimity. And the notion of enlargement does not mean I have to go ahead and change you to make you more like me. It's more about me accepting sort of where you're coming from. And this definitely works between men and women, because if you look at women, they haven't really gotten the best deal out of this whole so-called feminist revolution, because now they're doing the housework, raising the kids, and doing a full-time job. It's like, wait a minute, what happened here?
Right.
So there's this notion of where the exchange didn't properly happen. There are women incorporated into the work world, even higher numbers now in colleges and universities. They have adopted responsibilities and more work, and men have been kind of shoved to the side in this. And there hasn't been a transformation of their relationship with that. It's just like, what do we do now? And that's the problem with our industrial background. Once you mess up the grid, and all of its injustices and unfairnesses, and all, more or less arbitrary, engineered, imposed framework that did not respect 4+ billion years of wisdom of nature, then what you have is this dislocation and the sense of being lost. And that's where we are with men now. And even though women are coming up and they're beginning to reclaim their space and not wanting to be abused and so forth, we're in a really rocky area, because right now we are essentially reforming and transforming from an imposed industrial engineering, which is at a very artificial sort that didn't respect nature. And because we've been so cooked and programmed in that way, we haven't found a way to get back in touch with ourselves. Men's movements have tried this with the mythopoetic men's movement, drumming circles and sweat lodges and appropriating Native Americans and so forth. But in a way, we have to begin to do it in our own way. We can't simply, and I say this in the book in the introduction, we can't simply rely on archetypes. Those archetypes are honorable, the magician, the sage, all those sorts of things. They guide us, or they help provide a foundation or support, but they cannot be, I don't think, the guide going into the future. We can use astrology, we can use these very archetypal, we can use the influence of the planets, all these things to inform us, but they're not going to make our choices for us.
Absolutely.
And they're not going to make us who we are here either. So that's something we have to develop and bring forward.
Yeah. So now we're staring down the specter of post-industrialism.
Right.
Now we're dealing with what Alvin Toffler called future shock, or the third wave.
Mm-hmm.
And this throws a whole new set of variables into this equation about not just being men or women, but being humans.
Exactly.
And I think we're really headed towards the precipice of a significant crisis in this area. And we're going to get back into the spiritual male principle. Mm-hmm. But what are your thoughts on post-industrialism, AI, robotics, mm-hmm. and the replacement ultimately of the human? Where are you with this?
Well, the thing is, you'll notice that the Industrial Revolution's conceit was based in scientific materialism. Every aspect in philosophy drawn in, social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, the notion that everything's a mechanical process, that there's no spirituality at all within the Industrial Revolution. Everything is a machine to be run more efficiently. So the notion of spirituality at all is basically absent. It's a scientific, atheist, materialist framework.
Right.
It's about its elegance, or its higher principle is based upon the notion of an elegantly running machine.
Yeah.
Right? Or efficiently running machine. Well, that is as ugly and as bankrupt and as inimical to me as a human being and as a spiritual human being as you can possibly get. It says, reduce myself to an object. And you saw it with men. They went to factories. They went to cubicles. They became simply just functionaries. And I was once giving a talk with a bunch of ladies on gender and self-esteem in Lake Geneva, which is in southeast Wisconsin. And they were having the greatest time of their lives, a wonderful, vital community of women whose men died in their corporate jobs right after they retired in their early to mid 60s, because they had treated themselves as non-spiritual objects. They just got worn out like a cog on a machine. Okay, so the jury is in on on the Industrial Revolution, but we don't know exactly what to do with that. To me, the way in which we're being challenged as humans is to re-recognize our spirituality, that spark of life in us, that heart, the compassion. I talked about the 7 C's. We're going to talk about that later. But that our capacities of human beings are essentially emotive and of a higher nature. That this body is not the end and the beginning. This body is an instrument of expressing the spirit into the world. Our relationships between men and women are an opportunity to vivify who we are through that exchange, and rather than simply see each other as threats. That's our industrial legacy. Any organic, spontaneous, non-predictable, and remember, it was all about prediction and control, right?
And it's gotten even worse, right? With algorithms and data modeling and everything that's associated with this computerized and synthetic world we're inhabiting.
And it hasn't stopped. The information age has made certain things much more virulent. Mass data, okay? Artificial intelligence still is continuing this conceit to its ridiculous extreme. It's literally saying we can download our consciousness now into silicon chips. It's saying we can understand all your psychology and preferences before you even know what's going on, and we can sell to that. It's an extraordinarily developed science of dehumanization. Yeah. At the center of this conceit is the notion that the human beingness is the problem. We must extirpate masculinity, must extirpate femininity, we must extirpate spirit, we must get rid of race. All the wonderful, weird little wobbles that we have in order to have this super race, or this, this thing that can defy death, or this thing that can be downloaded infinitely into silicon chips and be perpetuated. That is death. What people don't understand is that is an illusory eternal life. And it is death. As soon as you give yourself to that mentality, much less that actuality, you are saying, I want to die. I don't want to live anymore. Spirituality is the exact opposite. The spiritual confidence is not only the ability to meet the challenges of this world, but to have this tremendous confidence in your divine genius and say, I can experiment. I'm curious. I don't need to be worried in this, social media image world about how people are looking at me all the time. I can simply just present who I am, develop who I am, offer who I am, in tune with the soul, or a higher mind, or a higher understanding of myself, and let that carry me and support me in my relationships with others and my relationship with my own soul development, spiritual development. It's very simple. It's very elegant. And if you notice, nature is that too. You look at a rose, and it was so funny because Regina, who is my wife, Regina Meredith, had asked this, I think, of Tim Freak. She goes, well, who created the rose? Because when you ask that question and answer that question, you see the mathematical precision and relationships in the petals of that rose. You know that there is a larger intelligence operating here. Absolutely. And it is a conceit to try to deny that and make ourselves the center and our own gods. Right. And it doesn't matter if that conceit is in patriarchy or some little philosophy that's decided that it's the best thing since sliced bread and everybody should listen to it. And I should know as an Aries about that mentality. But, it's funny, and I'm bringing it back to my Ariesness. How is it that an Aries, who is notoriously stubborn, willful, uses imperatives, doesn't ask questions, says this is the way it is. Right. How is it that I'm able to use my Aries mentality to adopt this much more curious and receptive standpoint? Well, here's the answer to that. I have found out that by asserting myself from this unique standpoint and being open and curious and listening to others, that it actually fortifies my sense of identity. Mm-hmm. It does not diminish it. It expands it. It makes it much more sort of bold, thrilling, adventurous. And that's, I think, that turn, and there was no big moment, like metaphysical moment. That turn, which took time to develop for me, has really helped me understand that even my ego, if it's serving the spirit, can be happier.
Well, you've tapped into the alchemy of astrology, because what you're doing is you're reaching into the opposite sign, which is Libra. Mm-hmm. And Libra is about inquiry into the other, yes. Right? And balance. And so what you've done is you've closed the gap on polarity, and that's integration and wholeness. And every sign can do that. Whatever your sign is, there's that other that's hanging out there in the background that wants to be integrated in the everyday life. So congratulations on that. That's actually really good work.
And a specific note on that in terms of astrology, I'm close to Pisces, and if you look at Vedic astrology, I am Pisces, and I have a lot of Pisces. I have a lot of Pisces characteristics. At Watery Boundary, the boundaries are not strict for me, quite fluid. And it's caused me problems, but it's also helped me be more open as well. Right. So that the first sign and the last sign, and I happen to bridge those two to a large extent. And my whole life has been geared toward integration, and I think it's been influenced by that.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go back in time. I want to go revisit life on the farm.
Okay.
And I think, and again, I've never lived on a farm, but I could imagine that there would be sort of built-in rites of passage on that farm. You know, whether it's cuddling the lamb or having to put an animal down or things that go along with that life. And part of, I think, one of the real challenges that we as men and women have succumbed, we've not been able to surmount is this sense of rites of passage, that we have meaningful moments when we're developing that shift us from one state of consciousness to another state of consciousness.
Right.
So I wonder if you could speak to that from your own personal experience and then kind of the larger picture around that.
Well, kind of dovetailing on our conversation before, I mean, you talked about putting something down. I had this friend named Jim. He was the nicest guy, literally the gentlest, nicest guy. And sometimes we had little kittens that would hide right underneath the stoop. They'd come off. And one kitten came out right when he stepped off, and he broke this kitten's neck. And he's the nicest guy. So it was completely an accident, obviously. And we had to put it down. We knew that kitten was going to suffer. So we literally had to whack it over the head with a shovel. Right. And to put it, and if you understand reincarnation, you know, this is, and you understand how the Native Americans would honor the meat before they would kill it, or the buffaloes, or whatever it happens to be. It's that honoring, even something as simple as that becomes a rite of passage. Because what you're confronted with is that life and death is not just built on intention. It's built on a lot of things, accidents, and you have to address it and respond to it in this heartful, present-oriented way, whether it's death or whether it's life, a new life coming in. And it's that kind of experience that creates these rites of passage in meaningful ways, because you're confronted with life and death, right? Whether it's the death of being an adolescent and you're brought through some kind of ritual as a young boy into sort of young manhood, through some kind of explicit ritual, or as in my case on the farm, I just saw life and birth, the cycle of life and birth. I saw cows being born, lambs being born. I saw cows getting out and the necessity of finding out where they got out and fixing the fence.
Right.
These all educated me in very real and concrete ways about how life works, about the interaction of people and animals and species. The problem with a lot of urbanization, as you've mentioned, is that it artificially keeps us from those rites of passages, which are tremendous gifts and necessities in understanding our relationship with life and death. And through that, and the urgency of that, and the power of that, our relationship with our own spirit and the spirits of others. So that, I think, is a challenge that we have right now. We're kind of in our hangover stage, obviously, but I think there is a beautiful opportunity here to draw from our various personalities, draw from our psychologies, our astrological signs, see what the real strengths are embodied there, and try to find ways to help each other move through this engagement with spirit and with life and death in ways that open us up.
Right.
Just have us look around how people are evaluating us or whatever weird thing that we're into now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, I agree. And you and I come from a different time. You know, you were born in 65, I was born in 60, you know, more analog, more organic. Now, you know, the rites of passage that you know, we're kind of touching upon here, they could happen in a video game where you level up and get to the next level. And it's also synthetic. Do we have a chance? Do we have a chance to break through this synthetic consciousness, which I think is basically this kind of wave that kind of moves through the universe and turns worlds into these kinds of mechanized and robotic societies or civilizations? Do we have a chance against this? And if so, you know, as men, how do we deal with this as kind of this existential and artificial threat?
Well, I think men do have a real important role to play, because I think to a certain extent, men have been the most sort of vulnerable to this. In my research on self-esteem, going back a little bit into my past, I did a doctoral dissertation on self-esteem. I was going against both the sort of male version of it and the female version. Not surprisingly, I had a third version that I was partial to. The male version is task orientation. objectified tasks, completing them, accomplishing, and getting self-esteem out of that. The female orientation was relationship, right? So having meaningful relationships, supportive relationships. Males like challenge, females like support. I end up saying we need a high challenge, high support alternative, third way of doing this. And I think that that's what we need in order to break ourselves out of this kind of stupor, this mechanized stupor. And it is a stupor. It's a kind of stupor that has oppressed women for quite a while and has said, you have to do what we say. It has oppressed men too, because even though men may have achieved some degree of material advantage as a result of patriarchy, the emotional and spiritual disadvantages that have been brought on by that, I think far outweigh the so-called material advantages. So we're both in this together. We're both going to benefit by breaking out of this mechanized prison that we've allowed ourselves to be brought into, whether you believe that's from outside forces and intentions or our own stupidity.
Right.
I mean, I'd like to think of the Industrial Revolution as an experiment that has completed its lesson, okay? Mm-hmm. It was a way for humanity to experience what it was like to objectify itself, mm-hmm. Okay? Well, the results are in, okay? Like any good experiment, even when it fails, it succeeds if it produces consciousness. So what can we learn from the Industrial Revolution that's going to help us reconnect, okay? What do we learn that's not going to work? What do we learn that is going to work? I think there could be some innovative ways to use video games. It's not the technology itself that helps connect us. The internet, I think, is doing a wonderful job in many ways of being able to connect us and help us understand ourselves as a global, more interconnected community. But that sense of nature, that sense of beingness, liveliness, spirituality, that's going to be a difficult one. I've done some little experiments, even when I was in seminary for a time. I was in seminary for a year and a half, believe it or not. I created a, quote, church, which is doing exactly as you say. It's always out in the woods. It's always engaged in observing the natural processes and trying to incorporate that into the way we organize ourselves. And not just in a stylized, intentional way like an Amish community, but one that's a lot more spontaneous and creative. Mm-hmm. We don't need that much. Literally, if you wanted to create a church that was a real one, the one, I call it the church in the woods, right? Mm-hmm. Where we literally have the services out there. We incorporate sacred rituals that seem to connect us with nature and with one another. Mm-hmm. We get rid of judgmentalism. We really embrace the uniqueness of people. You know, we don't care about how you dress or whatever. It's going to be functional because you're out in the woods. Right. That's the way it should be, right? You know, yep. Not in your so-called Sunday best. But that, I think that's a start. We're having people here beginning to get back into a farmsteading movement in the area we live in. They're mm-hmm. bringing their families back out to the farm. They're raising animals. They're raising fruit trees. Farmers markets are coming up. There's a kind of it's a kind of interesting melange between conservative sort of church, even sometimes mega churchy communities doing homeschooling, and the progressives over here who don't like the commercialism, you know, and this sort of dehumanization. So yeah. There's an odd mixture that's already happening in ways that I think are interesting. So yeah. There's things that are happening out there. And I think that we do have a chance, but we only have a chance if we allow ourselves to become real with what hasn't worked in the Industrial Revolution, and if we allow ourselves to open up and experiment with new ways to connect with one another and with our environment.
Right, I totally agree. And to your point about technology being something that can be integrated and used, I mean, if you look at some very successful homestead projects, they're incorporating solar, they're incorporating, you know, some very sophisticated systems in order for them to live off the grid and continue to have a, you know, kind of a comfortable lifestyle, right? Mm-hmm. So we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are things that we can use,
right?
But it's about having some kind of a conscious relationship with the thing that we're using, right? So that we're not just, you know, the back end of some, you know, consumer-oriented kind of, you know, algorithm.
Right.
And I think that's where it's at. So let's go back in time again. You're born and raised around a farm. You grow up. What happens after that?
Well, I think even I went to Ohio State as an undergraduate. Even then, I was very, very curious because I was born in a sort of unintentionally feminist environment. You know, I mean, there weren't these distinctions and roles. And I actually became very interested in psychology, but I was also very interested. I got a biology degree because I was very interested in life itself,
Right.
the study of life. I went into a physiological chemistry lab where we were separating out enzymes, and I was like, this is not for me. Talk about industrial, or these little labs that are, taking millions of grant money to do this find these little attributes,
Right.
of some enzyme and how it might help explain something. And I just said, this is definitely not for me. I knew it wasn't for me when Gretchen, one of the postdoctoral people, was so excited that she developed this new method and it worked out just perfectly. Like the gel separation column was working just perfectly. All the variables came together, and she was like, this had made her year. I was like, I should be that excited about something, and I wasn't. That's when I began to apply to philosophy of education programs. And I ended up entering one at Syracuse. We had a wonderful community. I had a great advisor, Emily Robertson. She's still alive and very dear to me. And she helped me explore what was a concern to me. And I always had a question about self-worth growing up. I had a pretty harsh dad from a immigrant grandparents, old school, kind of the king on the throne, or as I say in the book, the ruler on the throne, right? Versus the provider of the feast. So he had more of that. And I always thought, well, what would work to allow kids, or the wisdom of children, to filter up and be taken seriously? And as I went into college and took women's studies courses, I saw the same thing happening with women and femininity, that there was a wisdom there that was being kind of repressed or kind of neglected or cast to the side. Not only did I see it as being helpful for women, but as I was studying feminist literature, I saw that it was helpful for men. What are the costs to men of living a patriarchal life? That wasn't being considered. Men's studies wasn't around. It only came in response to feminism. And so I began to understand especially the emotional cost of a certain kind of dehumanized, mechanized masculinity. And that's when things really started to pick up. In my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, I was trying to develop an interpersonal understanding of self-esteem and self-worth, not just based in task, which was the typical stereotypical men's, not just based in relationship, which is the stereotypical women, but in a way that saw relationship itself as centered. And that's where the budding idea of this divine genius started to come up in me. Of course, you can't say that in a dissertation because institutions are very secularized, academic institutions.
Sure.
But basically, I was this notion that I have something very important to give, whether I'm a child or I'm a man or a woman, whatever. And I need to find out a way, and the way for me to get real self-esteem is to be able to offer that in a high challenge, high support environment to somebody else that takes it seriously and that contributes to the enhancement of a community, of a body of knowledge. Mm-hmm. So I began to develop a theory of that working itself out in educational environments, because I saw education as just being another industrial institution. Right. The desks in rows lecturing at you to help you absorb information. For what purpose? To make some guy over here a whole lot of money. And
which was another big reason the industrial age really took off, right? There were small group of people that said we could really profit off this if we.
It did, and it's great for reproduction. It's like a virus. It just reproduces like crazy. Now it's not great for transformation.
Right.
Great for having a sense of fulfillment or self-esteem, a real self-worth, because you are just a cog in that system. So I began to become a rebel, and I say this in my book. One of the most important things about a spiritually confident man is to be a rebel. Okay, to rebel against that dehumanization, to rebel against the messages implanted in you, to rigorously delve into your subconscious and look at all the programming and almost relish the adventure of doing that.
Right.
Instead of hewing to that and try to protect it against all comers, including women, and that's what I challenge men to do in this book and in life. I'm like, come on, guys. What about what we're holding on to is actually oppressing us and others.
Right.
It's really an advantage. Maybe you're going to get a little bit more money because you can pay women less or something, but what is it doing to you? Is it corrupting your own character? Mm-hmm. And so, to me, that's what started. And I kept on going from that dissertation. And I've always been in diverse kind of developmental environments. Mm-hmm. I really love transformation. On my website, citizenzeus.com, I talk about learn to transform. That's my motto. And then on Ask Dr. Zeus, my more sort of professional counseling site, it's all about transformation too and development. Mm-hmm. So to me, I don't think we get intimidated if we just look at all the things arrayed against us, all the habits that are deeply instilled in us. But we can continue the experiment. That experiment is mostly over. but we can continue to experiment. We're still human beings. We're still spiritual. We're still curious. And we don't have to look outside of ourselves for some overarching algorithm or solution to shift to. We can actually do it co-creatively. Yeah. We can say, I don't know what's going on. You don't know what's going on, but we have what we need if we explore.
I love that. I love that. You know, what's really struck me about your book and your ideas and presentation is that you are right on this razor's edge of the middle, but it's not a middle that's compromised. Like you could be like, some people will take that middle path, and the middle path represents some kind of tepid sort of, well, I'm not going to piss, you know, this group off on this side or this group off on this side. So I'll just kind of ride this rail down the middle.
Right.
You're not like that. I mean, your middle is an informed middle, and it's not exclusionary in terms of that middle, but it also has some defined limits.
Yes.
And I think it's the razor's edge, and it's one of the hardest things to be able to navigate through in life.
I think that's true. In fact, I kind of use it as a triangle in my book. What normally happens, and what the system is trying to try to propagandize you is to make, whether it's liberal or Republican, man or woman, is to make a dichotomy, a line, which is really the base of a triangle. And the moderate person you're talking about is one that just sits in the middle of that spectrum. And there's really, it doesn't matter where you are on that line, okay? As long as you've defined yourself on that line, you're not going to make any progress forward, because it's all different, basically different sides of the same dice or different sides of the same coin. Now, when you're talking about a triangle, we're talking about elevating and getting off that line. It can seem to be this razor's edge you're talking about. It can seem to be inclusive, and maybe some people even think it's somewhere on this line down here, but it's quantumly different. It's off that linear dichotomous line. It's off of it, and it's elevated. And that's what I'm attempting to try to do. You know, in that sense, I embrace the poles, not as oppositional, but as experimental, I guess you say, focuses of energy. But the whole focus and the dynamic, just like in, you know, the Hegelian thesis, antithesis coming together, creating the synthesis. Right. You know, the purpose is not to position yourself on here, but to use the energies of this, as well as masculinity and femininity, to create a much more vibrant personality, identity, and spirituality. Right. You know, and not to be trapped into just positioning yourself on what is essentially a bankrupt and kind of outworn system. Yeah. Way of thinking.
Yeah, I agree with that. So let's dive into the book. Let's get into the book a little bit. It's really, really, I think, very, very useful and very helpful. You've got a number of sections here that are not just clearly delineated, but you've got some nice pull quotes and all kinds of, you know, little just, you know, mind bits that you can just like jump into. You don't even have to read it sequentially.
No. In fact, I would say a lot of people will like just to go into the last chapter, which has to do with question and answers. I would encourage people to go to the last chapter and then even or pick whatever one they're interested in. It doesn't have to be read sequentially at all.
Yeah, and this is a really cool thing about this book. So I wanted to jump into page 186, and you and I talked a little bit about that before we got on the air today. That's the 7 C's. And it's a little play on words with the 7 C's, but these are the 7 C's that you have come up with for confronting and transforming patriarchal habits. So first of all, how did you come up with the 7 C's? And then we'll just kind of run through all 7, if that's okay with you.
I think it came a little bit out of my research. It came out of my engagement with the world. It really, really mostly came out of my engagement with my son. I started to think, what are the qualities that I would love for him to be able to embody? What a full rounded complement of things, you know, his quiver of arrows, you know, and what would be the arrows that he would have in that quiver. And I started going through it, courage, you know, compassion, and they were all C's. And I'm like, well, let's just go with that, you know? And I felt that it was a pretty full complement. They all basically start with C. And I said, okay, it's the 7 C. 7, as you know, is the sacred number.
Absolutely.
It was a nice play on words. It's a good mnemonic. And I just said, if people could have these and well-developed as boys and girls, men and women, I think we'd be in a much healthier position. And to go back with the earlier thing, we'd be much more equipped to experiment successfully and to experience successfully. So that's sort of what gave rise to that.
Well, let's jump into it here. First C, critical mindedness. Your first sentence here, critical mindedness allows you to analyze context, question your world, and challenge others respectfully.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You are a distinct human being. You're not only own education, but what you can offer others is based in that difference and distinctness. So you need to have a vivid understanding of contrast.
Right.
And you may be able to honorably and respectfully offer that into the world and be confronted with another person's. Through contrast, human beings learn. So instead of seeing it as a threat, we need to see it as an opportunity.
So I think it's great. And one of the things that I think has happened is that there's been this new age kind of redefinition of critical mindedness, which they've turned into negativity.
Right.
Right. Oh, you can't go there. That's negative.
Right. Right.
And what it's done is it's shut down our capacity to be critically minded, right? Exactly. To look at something and really question what's going on here.
Exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, I don't want to get so much into the issues, but whenever you have a politically correct mandate to say that certain people or groups cannot be even criticized, much less even be addressed in a way that challenges the underlying principles, then we're in again, we've objectified ourselves. We've refused to be human at that point.
Yeah.
You know, and become cogs. And I don't think that honors anyone, including the people these politically correct things are supposedly there to protect.
Yeah.
You know?
So, I agree. And it's always felt to me that it was some kind of a safeguard so that people could just continue to feel good.
Right.
In situations where a real critical nature or critical assessment of what they're going through would be the most important thing. And then through that, there's this network of enabling that takes place.
Right. And there are real consequences here.
Right.
Someone just the other day talked to me about a book that said, I want my sex back, about people who had gone through this sort of politically correct process, had changed their sex, and now were regretting it.
Yeah.
You know, because they hadn't had that critically minded engagement.
Yeah.
You know, and in a way that supported who they were, what these feelings were, without making a step that had a kind of irrecoverable consequence.
Right. This gets into the network of enabling.
Right.
Because there are other people who are invested in keeping that sense of either feeling good or participating in some new type of social moray. Right. That allows them to feel accepted with another constellated group that is accepting the same value.
And it's ironic, isn't it? Because think about it. By mushing everything out, you also are pressing and getting rid of that person's identity along with it. Absolutely. So ironically, the very thing that's supposed to support you in your uniqueness and identity, by making an external characteristic and basically propagandizing you into adopting other people's opinions, you've actually gotten rid of the vitality that gave rise to your individual identity to begin with.
Absolutely.
And it's so tragic.
Yeah.
So tragic. And so unnecessary.
Yeah. So criticism, being critically minded, now has been branded almost borderline hate speech, right?
Yes, it has been. And even the notion of being respectfully critical isn't even on some people's map. Their notion that they automatically think you're being critical in any way, that you're being disrespectful. I just, you know, I can't even deal with those kind of people. I'm like, okay, if you want to live in your fantasy world, I'm not going to, if you can't even accept the value of respectful critique, you can't even see that it can be respectful. It's really hard for me to even start a conversation at that point.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's your first C. That's your foundation. I think it's a good one.
Yeah.
Let's get to the next one, capability. Capability encompasses all those foundational aspects of the self that prepare you to engage more effectively.
Exactly. One thing that I do not like, again, and this is oftentimes coming from this sort of gushy, I don't know if we call it left or right or whatever, but the gushiness. It's this notion that if you just have a high opinion or you're just doing the best you can, and that's fine. I'm like, no, it's not. You know, and this is especially true with white people dealing with minority populations. I said, you need to give them the tools of power. You need to be very straightforward. You need to help with the critical mindedness and capability. Don't water things down. Tools of power do mean such things as the history of ideas, engaging Aristotle, etc. It doesn't simply mean, okay, we're going to help, you know, some kind of, you know, sort of vocationalized work thing. Strong intellect, strong engagement, strong understanding, and, you know, helping people rebel against and challenge the programming that gave rise to their situation. Mm-hmm. These require actually rigorous thought, training, development of content, mm-hmm. not just opinion, okay? Regard for facts, rigorous ability to see truth and falsehood, or the mix of them. These are all have to do with capability. They allow you to actually navigate the world. You wouldn't expect someone to just go out in the world and say, okay, you know, get to the next town over. All right, it's all your opinion. Right. It's all about your feeling. They're going to just get lost and never find it. Right. They need ways of orienting themselves. Right. They need things that have an actual purchase in the world. They need feedback from that world that says, hey, this isn't going to work. This is going to work. Right.
Well, what happens if society cultivates a group of people who downplay capability or promote something else besides capability? What happens to that society?
It deteriorates. It has to.
It's a society of children. Yes. Is what it is, right?
Exactly. A competence no longer becomes important. If you cannot have competence, how can you build anything?
Right.
And it also creates a fatuousness conceit, an egocentrism, you know, where it's basically, because what's the alternative to capability? It's self-service, right? Feeling good at all costs.
How does this apply to the spiritually confident male?
Well, the spirit is asking us to engage. How can you engage each other, the world, your own spirit, your own development? How is development even possible without capability?
Right.
It's not. You will not become enlightened by going to a guru, you know, and being part of an ascension group that's just, quote, holding the space. You need to challenge yourself with the world, with your body, with your mind, you know, and this notion that there's a soft way to do it that doesn't involve any challenge, I utterly reject that. Mm-hmm. This world is a challenge. It's not just a prison. It's not just a hell, okay, because some people believe that too. And oftentimes they're retreating from that and into these nice gauzy little philosophies. Right. It is an opportunity. And if you're going to respect your spirit and respect other people, you're going to honor them enough to be able to engage them truthfully. And sometimes that means contradicting what they say.
So the spiritually confident man mm-hmm. embraces the idea and the ideal of being capable and challenges mm-hmm. his capability on a consistent basis. Is that true?
That's true. That's absolutely true.
Good.
There's a discipline involved in that, as well as a vulnerability and a choice. And that choice is to allow yourself to be challenged. This is the problem where patriarchy falls down. It loves challenging other people. It doesn't love itself to be challenged. It has to be reciprocal. Everything has to be reciprocal here. Yeah. So, you know, in fact, a really spiritually confident man invites that challenge and sees in it a constructive and liberating potential. Mm-hmm. Because my own ignorance now is being dismembered. I want my ignorance to be dismembered by a capable other person. Right. You know, it's going to open me up, and it's also going to give voice to them, and through my appreciation of their challenge, support them in a very good self-esteem way that says, listen, I really honor you. You have transformed my life with your different viewpoint.
Right. Well, that takes courage. That brings us to the next C. Mm-hmm. And here's your opening sentence. Courage is one with calling out untruth and injustice. Mm-hmm. Calling it what it is.
Yep. Yep.
Courage is a very rare commodity in a time of commodification, which is where we are, I think.
Courage is very problematic for the commodity-based system that we live in. The courage, because courage says no. Yeah. It says yes to things that haven't been, and it says no to things that are right now that don't serve us. And that means stepping out of the group. That means confronting your own programming. That means getting into a vulnerable space, staying in that space till it teaches you its lesson. And it is, I think courage is, of the 4 C's, is one of the rarest in terms of the commodity, because we have been told that courage somehow, through educational system, church systems, all our social system, that courage is somehow impolite, or courage is somehow outdated, okay? We can just create a world in which everybody loves everybody else and there's no need for courage whatsoever. And I am here to tell you, courage is a virtue that will always exist as long as we're human beings. Yeah. Anytime in a developmental process, if you're going to step out of your current frame and you're going to try to grow, it's going to require courage, because you're going into the unknown. Any step into the unknown requires courage. Right.
I totally agree. You know, one of the things that, as a rite of passage, that I think most people go through, especially young males, young women have a different version of this. It still exists, but growing up during my time and your time, one of the things that we had to face were bullies. Right. We had to face bullies, and it took courage to face a bully.
Yes.
And this is part of a social order that to some extent even exists in nature. Okay.
Right.
It does exist in nature. And so you have to get through these periods where you build a psychic immunity.
It's true. And in some cases, a physical immunity. I have a great example from my own childhood growing up that perfectly demonstrates what you're talking about. I mean, I was being advised because I was being bullied. I'm a kind of a nerdy, you know, different kind of kid, as you can imagine. And I was a lot smaller back then. I really sprouted up in late high school and college. I was 5'1", I think, in my freshman year in high school. As I was wrestling at like the 98-pound, you know, weight level. So anyway, I was being bullied and I was being counseled by authorities to not stoop to their level, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't until I stood up, and as soon as someone came at me, I just came after them. And I didn't just come after them. As they were running away, I came after him and kept going at him and punching him, because I said, I have had it. And that's what created the real solution to that problem. All that nice talk and whatever, you need to speak in a person in the language that they are speaking. In that case, standing up for myself and being violent back was helpful. Now, I don't suggest violence. Most often you can avoid it and simply say, I'm not going to participate. And civil disobedience is probably the most effective social and personal tactic. Disobeying, rebelling against a violent dynamic and saying, I'm not going to be part of this. And if you do, my martial arts training is going to come into the fore. I'm going to warn you. I'm going to warn you. Right. And if you keep coming after me, you are going to regret it. You know. So that's where capability comes in and courage comes in there. Right. So, and I think we should teach. I think martial arts should be basically taught to every single child.
Oh, I totally agree. I think every child should know how to defend themselves.
Right.
And also there's discipline in martial arts.
And the philosophy of martial arts is to never use force unnecessarily and to use all other methods to avoid an actual confrontation.
That's right.
It's taught correctly.
Yeah. So I have a funny story to share along those lines. This is a few years ago. I was in Berkeley, and the SPLC Army was out in force, and they were wearing the red vest, and they were trying to get people to sign these petitions and have them donate money for their anti-bullying campaign.
Right.
Okay. Sounds, you know, nice enough on the surface, but really what they're doing is they're instituting a level of social change and order that don't allow people to confront certain things.
Right.
Right. To confront their fears, deal with issues like courage, all that stuff. Interactivity with parents. What do I do? How do I change this? So this guy was giving the spiel to this woman. And I said, and I walked up to him and said, you know, all you got to do is just teach these kids martial arts. That's all you got to do. You'll end bullying in a heartbeat.
It will.
And the guy looked at me like I was a leper, right? Like, get the F out of here, man. I'm closing a sale, dude, you know? But they were so invested. And the woman was shocked that I even had that kind of point of view. Like I was actually promoting some kind of violence in response to this, which is, it's anything but, it's anti-violent. Because when you're in those disciplines, you understand what it's like to be hit.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And it's interesting that the worst fighters are the bullies.
Oh, absolutely.
Because instead of looking at the motion and the movement and the force and how to apply it, you're thinking about your image. How do I look? Who am I intimidating successfully? And that's why bullies can oftentimes be beaten by a much smaller kid, because that kid is single-minded. I'm gonna punch that person where it hurts. Another guy's going, like this and looking around, and then bam.
Right.
And that's that. And again, martial arts helps because it focus, not only physical focus, but also focus in terms of mental focus, emotional focus, and I would even say spiritual focus.
Yeah.
It is not doing anyone any favors not to present them with the natural consequences of their actions. That goes back to nature again. You do not have that luxury in nature, all right? You will always experience the natural consequences of your actions in nature. Unfortunately, so-called civilization has made it its goal to get people to avoid natural consequences for their actions. And I just that is not healthy. That is not healthy at all.
I think the extreme of this, as an example, relates to this documentary that I just saw on Seattle. Have you seen this documentary?
I don't know.
It's gone viral. It's called Seattle is Dying.
Okay.
It's a 60-minute documentary that was put together by KOMA, which is a TV station up there. And it looks at the conditions of Seattle and what's happened on the streets of Seattle with itinerant drug users, homeless. It's a really bad situation. And what they basically have instituted there is a catch and release program where if somebody is found defecating in public or urinating in public or assaulting somebody, they're released. I mean, they've done the figures with people looking at between 35 and 40 acts of various, violence or desecration of social property over the course of about a 3 to 4 year period. And there's no 3-strike law there, right? So the city is enabling a whole group of people to not be responsible for their consequences.
Right.
And as a result of this, they're creating an underclass of just awful, drug addicted, and I think spiritually possessed people.
Right. It makes people very vulnerable. And you and I both know that one of the ways to be taken over and to have your healthy spirituality dispossessed is to get involved in physical addictions, drugs, alcohol, sex, misused sex. I mean, sex can be one of the most powerful and beautiful things spiritually. And I talk about that in the book as well. But it can also be a gateway drug into sort of emotional hedonism.
Right.
That doesn't, then again, the false dichotomy is Puritanism on the other side, that there's something wrong with emotional expression, sexuality, we got to shut it down.
Right.
See how these things play out? Yeah. Hedonism on one side, Puritanism on the other. Again, it's that false dichotomy.
Yep.
Honorable exchange of sexuality can be one of the most powerful spiritual practices, but it develops not by one person imposing their will on another one or shutting it all down. It develops when two people recognize sensually and essentially what they each have to give into that relationship, and they honor that, they embrace it, and they allow that energy that's being exchanged to determine them going forward, not one person's fantasy or one person's fear. Okay. And the problem with what you're mentioning here, it's saying, again, it's based on a suspicion of fear itself. Okay. It's based on trying to avoid any kind of discomfort. And that's, again, a legacy of the Industrial Revolution. It was the notion that we can get rid of any unpredictability or discomfort if we just engineer the perfect world.
Right.
What we do is we create a dystopia, and where, you see it in science fiction films all the time, when you're not allowed to express emotion and everybody's happy, but they're like, it's all shallow happy. Right. It's like the worst kind of autocracy where everything is pleasant, but nobody actually has any real essence or oomph. We don't want that world. We've already seen it in the sci-fi films. So let's not contribute to it by taking the legs out of someone experiencing their natural consequences and having a healthy regard for respect for others.
You know how many times I've heard people who've been arrested and they've had this continued cycle of abusing themselves and then as a result abusing others, and they'll say thank you.
Yes.
They'll say thank you for doing this, because
Right.
they know that they can't stop themselves.
Exactly. I worked in an at-risk high school in Alameda, you know, in the Oakland area. And that was what they said. We need real guidance, consequences, and structure. We need it. They would literally, in our little circle that we would have, that's what they were asking for.
Right.
Okay. And because, you know, their family structures didn't provide that.
Right.
And their school, honestly, there was a problem with the school itself too, where they were being kind of this sort of loosey-goosey progressive / liberal thing. And they were uncomfortable providing that. And I had to leave the school. I mean, there were other factors as well. But if you can't provide that, especially for an at-risk population, you are not serving them. You're serving your own perception and desire to be seen as a nice person, not actually helping them to equip them to be the kind of vital people they can be.
Right. Agreed. Let's get on to the next C, compassion. Compassion has to do with emotionally intelligent openness, connection, and loving kindness. A lot of times people mistaken compassion for weakness. You want to speak to that?
Absolutely. I mean, this is especially true in men. Compassion requires openness, and that openness can feel like vulnerability, whether it is or not. It oftentimes, because really, I mean, it feels like vulnerability, but what strength is there in opening up your heart and embracing somebody who's going through a difficult time, or embracing someone who's not well understood and you just take them under your wing, or who's someone you vividly disagree with politically and whatever, but you can still see their suffering and you're able to simply be there with them and say, how can I help?
Right.
I mean, when I put it in those terms, most people out there in your audience are saying, of course, men or women, boys or girls, that's exactly what we want. But now the question becomes, why don't we do it? Right? And then we start getting into the programming again. We've been programmed to identify with groups that are similar to us. We've been programmed to say, okay, that person is beyond help, so why bother? We've been programmed to say that person's going to spend it on alcohol or whatever. And even if that's true, you can still have a compassionate heart.
Right.
If that's true, you can still bring a meal that's actually going to help support that person.
Yeah.
And when I talk about divine genius, a lot of my notion of compassion comes out of my desire to see that person's soul develop as deeply and as far as it can.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to look for that unique talent, quirk, humor, whatever it happens to be in that person, no matter how tough and bad shape they are or how much we disagree, that I can connect with and bring forward in honor and respect. Right. And I think that to me, that compassion actually means to suffer with. Come meaning with, passion, one way to suffer. So that's that idea. Instead of just saying, there but for the grace of God go I say, there by the grace of God am I. That person is a reflection of my capacity to step forward and embrace somebody else. And if it makes me uncomfortable, that's a sign that I should step toward it instead of away from it.
It's an Aries response right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I am seeing in the world is that a lot of the things that we're talking about, or at least we're touching on, they're like core values that obviously you and I are agreeing upon, and a number of people who are probably watching this are agreeing upon. Those core values are being replaced at another level by values that mimic these values, but they don't really get into the roots of the values.
Right.
So I'll give you an example, and I don't want to make this too political, but I have to in some level. So we have like a shooting somewhere, right? Whether you believe that shooting is real or it's false or psychologically operative, whatever. What we're immediately being told to do is to be compassionate for this group or this event, which is so far removed in a lot of ways from our own experience.
Sure.
You know, and it feels like our compassion is being hijacked. Yes. And there can be a sense of real manipulation going on because they're getting into our emotional hoarding in something that we hold naturally. And it feels like that across the board, there are these replacement values or these replacement level feelings that we're all having to deal with. And I think that is a real challenge because, you know, we're dealing with levels of truth and the critical minded nature of what you're talking about. And at the same time, if we have a dialogue at a higher level with people that are assimilating around these other versions of these values, now we're in a clash. We're
Right.
kind of a cultural clash. And I think it's a really important distinction. And I'm going to just throw it back to you. How do we deal with that?
Well, I do a good example of that book in when I talk about the abortion debate. I also talk about circumcision, thanks to you.
Right.
But I mean, I said, when you allow yourself to be programmed into these segmented groups, there is no way forward. I said, and when I talk about this in my book about abortion, I use it deliberately because it is a very, very fraught issue. I said, I don't know anyone that's pro-abortion in the sense that they're trying to get the amount of abortions up, right? So we all broadly agree with that. I don't know of anyone who's anti-life. Even people who are strong in support of a woman's right to choose in terms of abortion don't see it as a helpful alternative. They want other alternatives. They want to get rid of unwanted pregnancy. They want greater support for young mothers, all these sorts of things. I'm saying, so why is it that we agree on really the fundamental issues around abortion, but we allow ourselves to be basically separated into these camps which are inherently adversarial?
Right.
That's where we have to rebel. We have to be courageous and say we refuse to do that.
Right.
We actually share these values, whether conservative or liberal. We all want the amount of abortions to go to zero. All of us do. Okay. And if that
I may take a little exception with you on that.
Okay. Well,
but I would say people who are true humans.
Right. Right. And I think it may be overstated. I mean, in terms of the industry, and maybe there's some other pressures going the other way, but for the most part, at least from my research, if not all of us, the overwhelming majority of us,
Agreed. Yeah. Yes, totally.
And the way to do this too can be very feminist, right? In the sense that you're really supporting the creative aspects of young girls. You're really supporting them to have better, body image. And you're doing that in ways that are supported concretely and not just, with silly little magazine articles and things like that. You're saying, we're going to get you into martial arts. You're going to feel your power as a woman and as a person, We're going to get young people to run cafes where there's art and there's music, and they learn to run their own business, which is a real basis of self-esteem, and not so much, just do another little glad-handing sensitivity seminar somewhere.
Right.
So, these are the things that we need to move past. We need to move past the way that we get slotted into situations where people can manipulate us by making it inherently impossible for us to connect across our differences. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we can challenge that. Whether it's with issues having to do with boys or girls, you look at, for instance, young boys getting involved in video games or just not having these rites of passages, or you look at young girls who are having the problems with body images right around middle school and the way they're being manipulated by magazines and fashion. Why can't we confront that? Why can't we confront that with positive, not just gauzy images, but actions, challenging actions and support, whether it's martial arts, whether it's sports, whether it's creating a magazine that has all different types of body, where you understand beauty in a much more expanded sense. And it requires all those C's: courage, compassion, creativity, that's one we haven't addressed yet.
Right.
And, I think the main thing that you're bringing forward that sticks with me is simply this: use your critical mindedness to see that you're being programmed and put into boxes that can't possibly succeed.
Yeah.
Rebel and refuse to do that, and start to engage in these 4 C's to go on a way forward. See where you actually have common ground with somebody else who has an apparent difference with you, and work on ways to work together to achieve that goal.
Right. I'm in, man. I'm in. I guess that makes me part of your community. That's the next C.
Yeah.
Community is personhood shared. Where do you want to go with that?
Well, that's just it. I mean, so many of our communities now, especially in this transitional age, you notice there's a magazine or an e-magazine for every little thing. Like, you could be black skateboarders who only skateboard on Tuesday. There's a magazine for you.
Right. It's true.
There's a new industrial habit that has gotten into the post-industrial world, and it's about personal preference. It's the notion of a good life is built on all your little teeny micromanaged personal preferences being fulfilled. That becomes the good life.
Right.
My sea of community is a challenge to that. It says the good life is not a good life simply based on these abstracted, siloed personal preferences and having them met usually from a consumerist rather than a productive mode. But in a community of mentoring and mutual regard, which says you have something that the entire universe doesn't have that you can offer. And I'm going to do whatever I can to create educational systems and spiritual support and practical support around that. And you are going to do it also to me and to others. Okay? Because this is the notion of service that is deeply rooted in who you are as a spiritual being. Not only the responsibility and obligation to help and support others' unique divine genius, but to offer and develop your own. And if we made it just that simple and we make community around the development and exchange of that divine genius, we'd go very far. You will find that kids have these weird little talents, right? That seem God-given, you know, and many parents will say, hey, this kid popped out of the womb and was music. You know, and if you believe in reincarnation, it's a pretty easy explanation for that.
Right. Where did they get it from? Well, they practiced it somewhere, right?
Yes, exactly. When you see those little child prodigies, probably didn't start, just on their DNA and just out of nowhere. But if we could find those, and if we could expand the notion of what a talent actually is, because if you have a really questioning kid and he's in a school or she's in a school, and this oftentimes happens with boys because they're very active and they're much more kinesthetic oriented and they're seen as troublemakers, or if a kid who's critically minded and is challenging the practices of the school, instead of smashing that kid down and saying they're a troublemaker, you're causing the system to not work efficiently, which is the industrial mentality, you can say, hey, there's an aspect of this, though they're a little rough, sometimes they are a little abusive, but there's an aspect of this that's really legitimate and part of their talent that they're bringing into this world. And we're going to help them distinguish between a disrespectful version of that and a respectful version of that. And we're going to allow ourselves to have the courage and compassion to have our own discomfort challenged in the face of that. We're not going to just use our power to make it, just comfortable for ourselves. So community really is about that. And there is no substitute for community. The rubber hits the road in community. A person can believe all they want, prefer all they want. They can be extraordinarily talented, but if a community doesn't accept that or doesn't encourage that, you're kind of left back into an alienated, isolated situation.
Right. And the 20th century has been another experiment in isolation and alienation.
Right. As you see that with video games and role-playing games now, it allows in virtual reality.
Yeah.
It allows people to basically create a whole world based on their own preference. Right. And have pseudo interaction where they don't actually have to even meet another person.
Right.
Because everything is just preferences based in a programmed virtual environment. And it's like, but follow that out. Do the extrapolation on that. If everybody did that, there's this wonderful book called The Electric State that I just purchased. And it basically sent an extrapolation of that. Mm-hmm. And I encourage you to do it because there's wonderful artwork and the story behind it. And these people had these things called, I think they were called neuro quarters or something like that. And they were living in their virtual reality, and they were literally just, they would forget to eat. They'd literally waste away and die because they're living completely in that world.
Right. Well, I'm a big deconstructor of commercials, TV shows, and movies. Mm-hmm. In commercials to a large extent because there's a lot of messaging that goes on with commercials. Right. And there's a commercial that's I think it's still being circulated. It's a Volkswagen commercial. Mm-hmm. And the commercial starts off with a group of women who are all pulling together. There's your community right there, right? 4 women, and they're diverse. We've got 2 women who appear to be so-called Black women and 2 so-called white women, whatever. And they're pulling together and they're moving stuff into their Volkswagen, hatchback or whatever, right? And so the idea or what you're thinking is, okay, well, they're moving it together. What you don't see, what you see eventually is where she's moving from. And she goes upstairs to get the last thing. And the last thing is an apartment that's empty, save her boyfriend, Jeff, who is sitting in a chair in the middle of the room with virtual reality goggles on.
Right.
Okay, so Jeff didn't even know she was moving.
Right.
Okay. And to me, this is fundamentally very telling.
Yes.
Because number one, it says, women are better organized and more suited to move into a new world because that's what she's moving towards is a new world.
Right.
and they have better relationships and better communication. Meanwhile, this guy who is still a boy, in a lot of ways, getting into this whole kind of dilemma around boys, is lost. He's a lost boy in a lost world. He lost a relationship, and who knows what else he's going to lose as a result.
Exactly.
And Volkswagen is exploiting that.
Right.
They're exploiting that image so that women, by buying their car, can feel more empowered and have power over this this spiritually and emotionally inept excuse for a man.
Right.
And that, to me, we get it. I'm sorry, getting my soapbox here, but when we get into stuff like, well, we're going to boycott Tucker Carlson because he said something.
Right.
Right. We're not going to, we're going to call up their sponsors.
Right.
And what, we're not going to buy their products. Why should we support a company like this that's promoting a vision of what theoretically is this very damaged and toxic relationship between the sexes, and really a really poor one for men, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because on one hand, it looks as if this commercial is supporting the move into that new world, and even challenging to a certain extent the way in which men have kind of siloed themselves into virtual reality and have not stepped up to the challenge. So you could read it critically from that standpoint. On the other hand, it's exploiting it to create an identification among women with their brand and with the notion that they can move on by themselves and just leave guys behind. Right. So, a lot of these things are double-edged. But I agree with what you're saying. It is, to me, a challenge. And the critical mindedness that you extended toward that, I think, is a positive example of critical mindedness. Because, again, the extrapolation, what if we follow this out? If women start leaving men behind completely, and I think that's one of the tough things about my book, it's falling in that kind of in-between space. Women are more concentrating on women now, me too. Guys are in that virtual reality world. My book is sitting in the middle here going, hello, guys. I'm trying to bring this together. Is anyone listening? Right. So it may take a while for it to begin to pick up steam. But what it's trying to do is say, listen, don't be those women in the commercial simply just leaving. Okay. And maybe women tried personally to address that guy and he was just too immature to meet the challenges. But we still need a community, going back to that C, in which there can be support for that dialogue. And there can be support for that man going beyond simply just living in his own virtual reality world. And that's where we all need to step up. I don't think it's just men need to step up. I think it's men and women need to step up and address that kind of immaturity. And I do in the book talk about the different levels of manhood. In chapter 2, retreating men is an example of this man. He's a retreating man, right? And there are more evolved and evolutionary, I do explain that in chapter 2, ways of getting beyond that. But maybe this book can be seen as a primer to begin to identify where men are on this evolutionary scale and to help create a community in which men like that can be effectively engaged. It is my personal deep belief that if a man feels his spirit, he will prefer that to a video game. But if a man does not feel his spirit, the video game is almost his only option. Yeah,
that's a very good distinction. And even looking at, we're extrapolating on an imaginary kind of premise, but it's worth looking into. Like, how did that young man get there, right? How did he become siloed off? What were the conditions in his life, right? Because I think boys have a difficult time. And I feel like that our culture has really put the shackles on boys in a lot of ways.
I agree.
It goes back to your, they're being, rambunctious or spirited or whatever. Now what happens? They get prescribed for, ADHD meds or,
Exactly. Where is the vision for healthy vision for boys and men today? Look around. You will not see it. You will not see it in commercials for the most part. There was an attempt by, I think it was Gillette, to say, is this the best a man can get?
Well, I was going to go there. I was going to bring this up to you. This is good. Go ahead.
And they're trying to challenge toxic masculinity, which I think is a good thing. But if you notice in the commercial, there isn't really a positive alternative to toxic masculinity. It's kind of like, let's stop doing the things that destroy women. Let's stop harassing or abusing women. Okay. And how can we honor women? never addressed. You can keep on going to other commercials, sensitivity training, and so forth. I've actually done a workshop, created a workshop that I'm trying to shop around right now. That's the replacement of sensitivity training. That says, listen, a lot of the problem between men and women in the workplace in particular is that there's a hierarchical relationship and it gets confused with the collegial horizontal relationship. Mm-hmm. And once you confuse those two, it's really easy to get mixed signals here. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea is to create an open system of communication and expectation so that men and women, if they want to date, they can date, but it doesn't intervene or create mixed messages. I'm trying to create, based upon these challenges, a respectful, honorable, effective way for men and women to communicate. What I'm not seeing in the world right now is many commercials or programs or anything like that honor men and their development and their contribution, especially vis-a-vis women. Right. Women's star is on the rise right now, and I really do believe the feminine is breaking through, and the movement is already well on its way, and women are rising up to begin to express and offer their voice. And I think men have a great role to play in supporting that and challenging that in supportive ways. But we still need a strong man to rise with that woman. Right?
To me, it's incredibly imbalanced.
It is. Right now it is.
Every week now, there's a new movie or a new TV show about some ass-kicking heroine with either superpowers or some kind of secret training from some MK Ultra program, gone bad. It's just one after the other. Now,
perfect example. What you're talking about, Captain Marvel in the comic books was a guy. The Captain Marvel that just came out is a girl.
Well, okay, so this is really interesting, right? Now there's a Captain Marvel from EC Comics, right? And didn't you go by Shazam or something like that, like the Shazam thing?
Well, it was very similar to Shazam. I think DC Comics was Shazam, and then I think that Captain Marvel was Marvel Comics.
Marvel, right?
But they had very similar powers. Yeah.
What's interesting is that Captain Marvel, who's this woman, right? From she's an astronaut, has the cosmic transformation deal, has all these superpowers. Mm-hmm. That movie's out now, and then the Shazam movie is coming out.
Right.
And the Shazam character is goofy.
Right.
He's like a superhero that makes mistakes and blunders, and so now we have the Shazam, Captain Marvel kind of thing going on.
Sure.
And one clearly is flawed and kind of dorky and adolescent.
Right.
And the other one, wow, what an elegant model to save the world, right?
Yep.
By happenstance, I don't know.
Well, I think films reflect and accentuate trends, and they do it for purposes of profit, and that's always the weakness.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you can take a perfectly admirable woman's attribute that's exemplified in Captain Marvel, and you can accentuate and exaggerate and get women to feel a sense of their own power in watching the movie. They did a pretty good job with that in Wonder Woman. It was a well-done film in which that happened, but there was also a very sympathetic, mature guy character in that film played by Chris Pine who had honor. And there was a nice reciprocity there. I see that as a much better demonstration of a respectful and even treatment of men and women in a situation. In a lot of these other ones, there is exactly as you say, they're accentuating, just like commercials do, they exaggerate for purposes of selling or creating an emotional reaction or establishing. As long as we're critically minded about that's what's happening, and that even if we go on that journey, that's not reality, that's built there to create an emotional response, and we take the responsibility to go back and say, wait a minute, men since The Simpsons and Married with Family started have been consistently portrayed as kind of lovable goofballs, incompetent goofballs, and the Lisa Simpsons of this world, and the women of this world are the ones that are competent in holding things together. Actually, that's somewhat of an accurate, not inaccurate, but an accurate description of a lot of what's had to be done here. Men have, by their own, not by women, but by their own fault and admission, kind of coasted on entitlement, have used women largely the world over, and they are perfectly responsible for that. but the solution isn't to systemically castigate those men and say, get your crap together, especially if they're boys.
Mm-hmm.
You need skills to do that. You need a place for a new form of masculinity to emerge. And if you keep on using men and beating them down in order to uphold women, now you've got the problem in reverse that was happening before, where men were beating down women in order to hold themselves up. You can't.
It's an overcorrection.
It is an overcorrection. And I think that's how history often moves. But now with this book, I'm trying to help move that correction into this much more balanced format.
Well, one of the examples that you use in the book is the movie Gladiator, mm-hmm. and how Maximus portrays a healthy masculinity. And you just go right through the movie and talk about decisions he makes, loyalty, clarity, acts of conscience, courage. I mean, it's all kind of baked into that film.
Absolutely.
You want to talk about the character in the movie, and then let's move that forward. Go ahead.
Yeah. He kind of embodies all the 4 C's, all the 7 C's.
Yeah.
And he's a warrior. So, this notion of trying to simply tamp down masculinity, that even if it's not physical battle, like Cameron Crowe played the character Maximus here there is integrity. I have him actually as an example of the highest form of masculinity, which is a spiritually confident man. There's 3 different forms of co-creative man. There's the despairing man who's now faced with the emptiness of his existence. He goes into it, he explores it as a searching man, and he comes out the spiritually confident man, because even if his wife has been killed and his son has been killed, as he has in that film, he's still going forward in courage, in compassion, in creativity, with capability to engage the things he knows need attention. And he's doing it from a masculine standpoint. He's doing it from protection, sacrifice, serving. Traditional masculine things. He's doing it from progressive and liberal masculine too. He's a deeply caring person, right? He's an advocate for the justice of the gladiators and workers. He's an advocate of democracy versus this emperor, and he's willing to stand up for it and against tyranny. So these are all aspects, and they really require a much broader based human being in order to embody. I find that, and certainly Regina found that to be an extraordinary example of manhood in action. Mm-hmm. No woman is going to say no to a guy who has integrity, sensitivity, and is willing to protect as well. Mm-hmm. And the problem, again, with industrial masculinity is that it has separated these out into cartoonish stereotypes of different kinds of men. Mm-hmm. Like I say in the book, the wet noodle man, the sensitive new age guy, right here, who's never going to step on he's going to be just a pale reflection of what you want as a woman. And then the toxic man over here, it's just, he's got an alluring desire for you, but he also wants you to do exactly what he says. Mm-hmm. Why do we need to give in to these split up stereotypes? Why can't we have a much more cohesive blending and mending mm-hmm. of these aspects of masculinity? But the point I wanted to, again, bring up with what you just put out there, where are those examples and attempts to actually look at the next development of masculinity in this world? Doesn't just fall on past archetypes, doesn't just make fun of men and say, oh, just move to the side, it's woman's turn now. My book is trying to do that. Okay.
I think the mob mentality has gotten to such a level that I believe either directors or producers or script writers, I think they are hesitant to make movies like Gladiator, because I think they think they'll be shouted down. And I think there is a social script now that creative types are very willing to engage in because it matches kind of this program. And if you go against the program, there's been such a sense of activation. You can see this on Twitter or YouTube, where people will go after somebody and say, well, your tweet was toxic, your tweet was, and next thing you know, they're deplatformed. Mm-hmm. Or their channels been deplatformed from YouTube. Yeah. And I think this is happening more and more frequently, so that it's actually beginning to get into the creative mindset, and they're censoring even before the process begins. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say, I think that's probably happening, because what happens, like any market, they're looking where the trends are,
Right.
and they try to accentuate those trends and then dominate that segment. And right now that segment is in emerging women, and by accentuating, exaggerating it, has a bad point of programming our society to see people in certain ways, but it also allows them to capture that market. So the antidote to that is not simply just going along with it, but asking questions.
Right.
To me, you don't have to shout someone down. You simply say, where are you coming from? And sometimes people can be very inarticulate about that. If you see a disgruntled guy who's, your basic 70s plus, Trump supporting guy or whatever it happens to be, he may not be the most articulate about why he's having these feelings. But if you take the time, and the person isn't hyper defensive, sometimes it's hard to reach people, but a lot of people, you'll find out that there's underlying grievances. And if you can have the boldness, the courage to recognize, and the compassion to recognize those underlying grievances, then there's at least some way of connecting, respecting with that person, right? You might not do something directly about it, but at least you've had that conversation and a respectful interchange. And that's what we don't have in a consumerist society. If we had a more production-oriented society where we're trying to produce good things, effective things in the world, better ways for our boys to go forward, you'd see a lot more attention gathered on, okay, maybe this is the truth. Maybe, maybe men have fallen down. Are we just going to keep them down? Or are we going to go ahead and really creatively brainstorm about new vital forms of masculinity that are not just involved in trying to basically castrate spiritually or emotionally their ability to be a man, to assert. That is not inherently combative or aggressive. In fact, women enjoy a guy who has desire, who has part of that animal man in them. So we don't want to lobotomize that or to surgically remove that. We just want to allow it to evolve into much more honoring forms and much more powerful forms of interchange. Mm-hmm. And again, that's part of what I talk about in my book. And it's tough work. And the reading sometimes can be a little bit challenging and tough because I'm confronting so dramatically these little boxes that we put ourselves into, saying, no, we have to get out of these boxes. And it does strain the brain a little to read the book. That's why I sometimes say, go to the end of the chapter. I do some basic question and answers, and maybe that'll be a warm up for you to go toward the beginning. So,
So questions and answers, probably a good time to check in with the YouTube experience, see where people are. Let's see what we got here. We got 75 people watching. Let's see. Let me just throw this out there to the people that are in the chat room on YouTube. Do you have any questions for Zeus that he could answer? And throw that out there. In the meantime, why don't you and I touch on circumcision a little bit?
Okay. I was going to also just throw out there too to your audience. The other two C's, by the way, are creativity and cosmic perspective.
Cosmic perspective. Let's just cover those real quickly, just to be complete here. You talked a little bit about creativity. Jump into that, and then let's transition to cosmic perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what aspect of creativity are you interested in? I'm here on the page right now, and
creativity helps you elicit and incorporate higher thoughts and feelings into the earthly realm. I think creativity is really important, and it separates us from other species in a lot of ways. Yeah. And not that it's a bad thing, but it separates us. It gives us our divine spark.
It does, and to me, it's the most fun and the highest form of existence on this planet. Yeah. Of all of them, I'm not going to say one is more important than the other, but for me, creativity is probably the most powerful form of existence on this planet, because you are taking things from an inspired realm, passing them through your individual, unique, divine genius and being, and you are bringing them out into the world. That's right. And there's nothing more beautiful than that. When you see beautiful flowers and so forth, these are expressions of creativity, divine creativity. And I think all institutions, if they're going to call themselves helpful at all, should be oriented primarily toward creative expression and creativity. Yeah. And it ties in with cosmic perspective in the sense that this is where the unique human being and the unique individuated soul meets the one God or the one soul, right? The overarching, if you want to call it collective unconscious, whatever it happens to be. And it's where the two of those meet that life really becomes interesting. You can feel deeply connected to the entire universe, the entire ecology of the earth, whatever it happens to be, through this notion that I'm expressing something unique through my being that is creative.
Right.
And it's fun. I mean, creativity, we've been taught not to be creative, that it's unpredictable. Again, industrial era, if there's one thing I have, there are many, many problems I have with it. But I think my primary criticism is that industrial and the institutions associated with the industrial era squashed creativity, the one spiritual activity we have on this planet to hold on to. In fact, love, to me, is the highest form of creativity. And sexual love should be creative. Right. It shouldn't just be channeling somebody into some fantasy. And it shouldn't be just simply just getting off. It's a creative expression, a merging of beings. And so that, to me, is an extraordinarily important one. And the cosmic perspective one, I would simply say this. It's so easy, especially when we're pigeonholed, and we pigeonhole ourselves, especially in a social media environment, to forget the big picture. And I'm not just talking a big picture philosophically, but existentially and spiritually. How am I connected to this earth? How am I connected to that person? How am I connected to this overall picture? And am I helping and enhancing that and deepening that? Or am I detracting from that? So, you know, and that goes to soul development too. You ask those questions and your soul will respond and say, maybe you shouldn't treat that person like that. Maybe that thought, even if it was justified, is not constructive. It's not going to lead you forward. It's going to hold you back.
Well, I think if a person is spiritually attuned, they're not dealing with a lot of distractions in their life. And distractions could be anything from habituation, right? A habit, an addiction, whatever. Then they can get these messages a lot more clearly. And then they can hear them go, oh, wow, okay, I may need to refine that, or I may need to rethink this, right? When these other things get in the way, I think that it gets harder and harder to kind of have that internal response mechanism. So
I think so too. To me, you were saying, we have to have new ways of looking at the world. And, it's interesting because you did put that thing, you were talking to Regina about circumcision. Yeah. And I had in the middle, it was pretty much the last thing I added to the book. Yeah. And so I had the benefit of having the 7 C's and this whole book laid out. And I'm saying, okay, Zeus, if you had the spiritually confident perspective, co-creative perspective, and you're going to apply it to this subject, what would that look like? So I did some research and I just allowed myself to be an experiment in trying to be a co-creative, spiritually confident man and applying it to circumcision. And that's how that came out.
It's a big, big topic, and one that I felt very strongly about with my son, in relationship to it. And the more that I read about it, the more that I felt like it wasn't anything I wanted him to participate in. And that actually wound up being the case. And, it was, I don't know, it feels like this invasive operation that literally takes the top off of our masculinity in a lot of ways, right? Literally and figuratively, just takes the top off of it. And I think we wind up in a state of early trauma and recovery over the course of our lives from that moment forward. That's my opinion.
I think that's not far off of my opinion. I think the primary unconscious motivation for circumcision, for all the customs and so forth, and I'm not going to try to challenge it. It's ironic because Muslims from the Abrahamic tradition have about 80% of their people, their boys circumcised too. And you have them, at loggerheads with the Jewish population who use circumcision as a way to basically distinguish their tribe from all others. Right. hopelessly ironic that the very reason for circumcision to begin with, which is to see basically that, what tribe you're from is completely and hopelessly intermingled, because the two traditions are Abrahamic and Christian as well.
Right.
But when you go back from that part and you simply look at the effect on the emotion, on the spirit, it's traumatic. There is no way to, not even advocates of circumcision will, for the most part, try to soft sell the notion that it is traumatic. They'll say, well, it's necessary, and they try to make some notions about diseases happening under the foreskin, most of which have been completely debunked.
Right.
I think the real function of the circumcision is to put young boys under the aegis of older men, and I think the same is true in sending boys off to war. Mm-hmm. I think it is to say that this world is based on fear and pain, so better get with the program. Mm-hmm. I think it is saying that the most tender and dear parts of you are not yours, they're ours. Mm-hmm. So we're going to let you know from a very early age. And I think child sexual abuse is an adjunct to that.
Interesting.
It's a way of taking the most innocent, most dear parts of a person and saying, they're not yours, they're ours.
Right.
This is us. And so by getting rid of circumcision and getting rid of child sexual abuse, which I think is really, if you want to talk about conspiracy, the thing that is absolutely undergirding the entire global elite system is this ability of using innocence in these ways, turning spirituality against itself. We would have, and the view of sexuality itself between men and women, if we could have those transformed, this world would look massively different overnight.
I think if that could happen, we could turn the planet around in about 2 generations.
I believe so. I believe so. Here's what's happening underneath all of this. And it's deceptively simple with all the bells and whistles and all the propaganda and everything else. Here's what's happening underneath it all. The dark, and I talk about this in the book, cannot produce its own energy.
It's true.
It's always parasitic. Old guys, church officials, whatever, stealing the innocence of young boys or young girls through sexual abuse. Taking that innocence in the energy generated and the trauma generated around circumcision. Okay? It can only attempt to dominate what is truly the thing that gives light in this world, which is spirit. Mm-hmm. It can only attempt to replace it or stand in for it or substitute for it, but it always knows it's dependent on the spirit and that the spirit is primordial. So when I talk about a spiritually confident man, I'm talking about reclaiming the primordial nature of the masculine spirit and refusing to be brought into the archonic forces or the oppressive forces, whether the patriarchy or something else, which would try to convince us and get us to align with the notion of the lower over the higher, over that thing which cannot produce its own energy, which cannot create, which cannot illuminate, which is only dark, trying to pass itself off as what is truly powerful. And it does that by trying to set the world against the spirit and saying, if you're going to make it in this world, you got to listen to us.
That's right.
We're going to cut off, we're going to whack off part of your penis.
Yeah.
We're going to go ahead and abuse you. We're going to let you feel all that trauma. Unless you get with our program, you're not going to be able to manage that trauma because this world's not built for the spirit. It's built for us.
Right.
And I'm saying in this book, this world was not only built by spirit and for spirit, and so are you, men, women, boys, and girls, but you have the obligation and the adventure to rebel against that, to call them out. You don't even have to fight them. You just have to call them out and say, I got your game. I got your game. Archons, dark forces, you cannot produce your own energy. You are like a chemical battery. You just run out. The spirit, my spirit's a rechargeable battery. I just have to link up here and it comes through me. I wrote a whole book on this called Spirit Athlete. It was too advanced to be released. So I'm waiting for a time because it could be dangerous if it's released right now. I'm waiting for a time where it showed how that energy comes through the body and comes out into the world, okay? But I can tell you this, you can always distinguish between a dark force and a light force by this simple test. Can it produce that energy or channel that energy into the world? And does it create blessing, illumination as a result? Or is it doing the opposite? Is it using? Is it a taker?
Mhm.
Is it a ruler on the throne, which is parasitically siphoning off energy, trying to create situations of want and fear so they can have control? And what's that control based on? The fundamental insecurity that's a real insecurity of the dark forces, which is they can't produce their own energy. They're dependent, and they try to pretend that they're the powerful ones. But you can always unmask them with that one simple test.
That's so ironic that they portray themselves as all powerful when they really don't have any power at all, which is really cuts to it. Yeah.
Exactly. And you can see that. You can see that when something as simple as a bully. Once you call a bully out, they're almost defenseless.
Yeah.
The only power they have is the perception that they're more powerful, not the actuality and reality of them being more powerful. Once they're called out, they're exposed as extraordinarily weak.
Right, right. William Blake has a great saying for that. It's speak your mind and a base man shall avoid you. So,
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that, as you were talking, one of the things that clicked in for me was this idea of emotional and material larceny that men became subjected to, you know, over the course of the 20th century and the industrial era, right? Like this idea that they would sell out, excuse me, on some level, right? They'd look the other way, whatever that other way was, in order for them to have material gain, material power, right? There's a kind of a spiritual and emotional larceny. It was like, we're going to give you this.
Yeah.
If you sign off on it, right?
Absolutely. You bet.
Yeah, here's what's happening. I see the same thing happening with women. And I see the same thing happening with this ramp up of kind of feminine consciousness and feminine culture. And there's another kind of emotional and commercial material larceny involved.
Absolutely.
And women of the world need to be aware of this, because I'm already seeing like sort of this sort of rumble beneath that program.
Sure.
And it's taking place in athletic competitions when so-called trans women are now competing with so-called real women, right? And it's being allowed to take place. And it's like, women of the world, just look at that model, right? Because this is the same model in some ways that men have succumbed to.
Absolutely.
Right.
Learn from our mistakes.
Yeah.
Learn from our mistakes. You know where that road leads. Just look at patriarchy. If you have matriarchy, it's going to go to the same place.
That's right.
It's going to go to the same place.
That's right.
Women are superior to men. Now women are, now they have, you know, entered into the world of the sort of material inducements. You're going to sell your soul. What would it profit a man or a woman, right, to gain the world if they lose their soul? The whole point of existence on this planet is to develop the soul. You certainly can't develop your soul by losing it and selling it. So don't. Simply refuse.
Right.
Take the high road. I mean, and the high road doesn't mean you have to live in poverty and be in a monk or a nunnery or whatever it happens to be, right? The high road is simply to engage from this authentic place and rebel against these messages. Don't allow yourself to be suckered. We already know the outcome of these. They're very consistent. One thing I did make sure to put in the book is to give people a little bit of a roadmap. You know, these little dark horses, they try these deceptively simple but completely wrong, you know, methods and formulas. And the whole notion is, one of the notions is now women can do what guys did and become materially successful and sell their souls just like guys did and expect a different result. Not going to happen.
That's right. That's the emotional and material larceny. That's in place.
And I like that term. I really like that term, Robert. Yeah. Emotional and material larceny. That one I'll put in quotes and remember, because that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Well, let's just check in with the chat room real fast one more time. See if any comments or questions. Let's see. Paulette says, Zeus, thank you for explaining what you mean by a spiritually competent man. Prior to show, it was just a Regina Meredith phrase used to describe her husband. There you go. It's your living, breathing example. How do you like that, Zeus?
I love it. I love it because, you know, we talked about, Regina and I have talked about that in terms of me stepping forward and people beginning a flavor of the ways in which, you know, what I'm trying to provide in and of myself. But again, that it's been heavily enhanced and deepened by my relationship with her, and vice versa. So, you know, we're all in this where we're trying to get an understanding of the person by themselves, but also in relationship to someone else. So that's a really kind of nice supportive remark. I appreciate your audience for that.
Here's a question. Zeus, may I ask which discipline MA in Taoist am? Yes, is that good? I'm not quite sure, Sticky. I get the question.
Well, I mean, if this person is interested in what sort of religious traditions or spiritual traditions supported what I did, my actual degree was in the philosophy of education, in the cultural foundations of education. So I studied psychology, history, sociology, right, as well as philosophy in depth, and anthropology in depth as a background. It was an interdisciplinary background. In terms of the spiritual traditions that have really informed me, when I was at Syracuse, I even engaged in this 2-hour-long Buddhist performance. I was in seminary for 1.5 years, and that was a Christian seminary. I've really, if anything, I would say I'm a mystic. I'm really, really drawn to the mystic traditions in all of the different religions: Sikhism, Christian, Mahayana Buddhism, mystic Christianity. And I think that I'm drawn to those. Let's see, what else is there? Hinduism, that's Sikhism. Yeah. So, I mean, Sufism too. Yeah, that's the Muslim one. Right. And in all of those, why I was drawn to them, and it filters definitely into my work, and you'll see it when you stuff I produce, is I'm really interested in how that spirit translates itself directly, without mediation, into the world, into masculinity and femininity. Yeah. Those archonic forces that I'm talking about like to insert themselves as middlemen and then divert that. Right. So I'm very suspicious of any kind of institution or thing that says I'm the guru, or you have to come through me in order to really find God. I'm always looking for direct avenues between your soul and yourself, and the spirit, the larger spirit, God, whatever you want to call it, and your soul. So I'm trying to eliminate all the middlemen, and my book is an attempt to do that for me and for your audience. So that's kind of where I'm coming from there. That's the mentality behind it.
Well, let's bring the book front and center one more time. That's it right there. The Spiritually Confident Man. Oh, and there's a little subtitle: Pioneering a New Frontier of Co-Creative Masculinity. Right there. And where can they find this, Zeus?
You can find it on Amazon. You can also order and get good discounts on my website, Ask Dr. Zeus, AskDrZeus.com. Go under the products part. And if you want to buy several books, you're going to get a nice steep discount you won't find on Amazon. So you can, those are the two main sources of that I put it out on. And it's also available in a Kindle version as well as a print version.
And
I was going to say, if your audience is interested and really, really stoked about this issue, I'm also opening for doing some kind of facilitated discussion around this. And I'm not at this point even charging for it. If you got someone who's willful enough to say, I have a bunch of women I'd like you to talk to, and we'll discuss this book in greater depth, I'd be open to that. And I'm not even at this point going to charge for it.
Great. That's awesome. Take them up on it.
Yeah. And this is the other thing too, is counseling. On that site, you'll also see that I do counseling sessions around the sacred masculine and feminine in this much more applied, direct way. So if you like what I'm saying, please stop by and go for a 15-minute free consultation and see if it works for you as well.
Well, this has been really great. I really appreciate your time. And I knew the timing would be right, astrologically. And I think you hit it out of the park today. So
thank you, Robert. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do this. And again, if they have questions, if your audience has questions that come up, Zeus at AskDrZeus.com. It goes right into my mailbox. I can answer the question, and I welcome all of those things.
Well, let's get you back on one of these days, and maybe what we could do is we could have a specific figure or an event or a topic, and
sure,
kind of jam on it about 30 minutes or so.
Yeah,
about maybe somebody in the media or in the world that is male, and what are they doing? What are they up to? Where's this going? I think it'd be kind of fun that you and I could.
I would. I love the application. So I look forward to that, Robert.
Let's do that. Right. Hey, Zeus, thanks again.
Okay.
Have a wonderful day. Okay.
You too, Robert.
Okay.
See
Bye
you.
for now.
Bye-bye.